So maybe we could jump immediately to the case of Mahmoud Khalil, the first person who had his ex-student, I guess he was at the time, who was lost his immigration status by virtue of his Palestine advocacy. So maybe you could tell us a little about him and then what's going on with him.
Yeah, sure. So his immigration status was actually as a lawful permanent resident. He's married to a United States citizen when he was arrested from his Columbia dorm and without either an administrative or judicial warrant effectuating his arrest. His wife, Noor, was 8 months pregnant. She's since had their first child, a boy, while he was in detention. The ICE officials who arrested him said that that his student visa had been revoked, and when his wife went into her apartment to obtain and show them his green card, they sort of, floundered and flubbed and said, "Oh well, his green card has been revoked also." And then he was sort of spirited away to Louisiana, like the government has attempted with all the individuals they have arrested pursuant to what I'll later describe as the unconstitutional Rubio policy, namely to sort of move them into the modern equivalent of Siberia. The immigration judges in Louisiana are notoriously terrible and pro-government, and to isolate him 1,500 miles away from his lawyers and his wife. And then the stated grounds for his removal and the cancellation of his lawful permanent resident status is something that I think should be chilling to all of us. The government has invoked an almost never before used provision of the Immigration and Nationality Act, the so-called foreign policy bar, that in theory allows the Secretary of State to remove someone or deem someone removable if they have engaged in activities that have potential adverse consequences to the United States government. It's conceded that the only activities for which he's acting adverse to U.S. foreign policy interests is criticizing U.S. foreign policy and its support for the Israeli onslaught on Gaza and the genocide there. And simply because the Secretary of State deems that activity contrary to this speech activity, contrary to U.S. Foreign policy, they are trying to remove him, and an immigration judge agreed with that determination.
So, first of all, just that particular clause of the Immigration and Nationality Act seems to be a font of arbitrariness just on its language, right? It just says an alien whose entry or proposed activity in the United States the Secretary believes would have potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences, can have their status removed. They're inadmissible. So, I mean, there doesn't seem to be much legal constraint there. It's like total discretion of Marco Rubio. He could just say, he doesn't like your haircut or something like that.
That's right. There's also this pretty profound due process problem. How does anyone know ex ante, as in terms of void for vagueness, does anyone know what activity might be adverse to the U.S. foreign policy interests and therefore get them deported? Any criticism of the United States, any conduct supporting Ukraine, could be enough. So at a very fundamental due process level, this seems unsustainable. And I don't know if it's ironic or dark, really the only federal court to have evaluated this foreign policy bar made this determination that it's, unconstitutionally vague, unfathomably vague. That federal judge who made that determination was none other than Marianne Trump Berry, President Trump's sister, who's since passed. And her decision was reversed, although on jurisdictional grounds, not on the merits, by none other than Third Circuit Judge Samuel Alito, who I'm sure is itching to take another crack at this and defend it on the merits.
And what is it that you think Columbia should do? Tom and I are both sitting in universities, and there is a lot of discussion about what is the role of the institution, both in protecting student protesters and protecting, speech on campus, but also academic freedom more broadly, of faculty also expressing themselves. And also that there have been a number of parts of universities that have received these congressional inquiry letters. So within the context of Khalil's case, what should have been the role of Columbia, and what is it that you are hoping universities will do in these kinds of situations?
Yeah, so Khalil wrote to high-level university administrators saying that he feared ICE action imminently because he had been seeing ICE on campus, and he never got a reply, which I think is not surprising to him. So, it seems to me the university in some ways created the conditions for this kind of crackdown on students by never suggesting there be sort of any support for these student activists vis-a-vis the federal government or their antagonists from these radical pro-Israeli groups, and sort of, largely put their students on a silver platter when they knew or should have known something like this would be coming. I think more broadly, universities like law firms or like other institutions need to sort of stick together and resist the attempt to distort this very serious charge of anti-Semitism and collapse any sort of academic treatment or advocacy for Palestinian human rights into a definition of anti-Semitism, which the administration is pushing and is contrary to principles of academic freedom or just basic critical inquiry. But I think they need to do that collectively because the administration, as we've seen, succeeds when they're sort of picking off one or two universities and targeting them with their full wrath. And so, maybe in Columbia's defense, they were the first to go. But had they stood up, I think other universities would have been more emboldened to stand up. I think another example of this that's, adjacent to, but is we're representing Professor Sheila Bedi at Northwestern. She's a clinical law professor. And her work was targeted by the House Education Workforce Committee, formerly led by Elise Stefanchik, and their sort of, their persecution of the university presidents at Penn and Harvard. That committee issued a subpoena to Northwestern demanding information about Sheila's work and donors. And it's, again, very clear that even though they use the verbiage that, she's controversially engaged in movement lawyering and racial justice lawyering, it is, I think, 100% clear that the primary reason they've gone after her is because of her support, her legal support, constitutionally protected legal defense of students who were involved in protests in Chicago over Palestinian human rights. I mean, that's the point. And we and other lawyers file a TRO, a temporary restraining order, against the committee to stop them from pursuing these records. Because Northwestern was going to comply. They weren't even going to seek an extension. They were going to sort of hand things over, even though it wasn't even a legally enforceable subpoena. It was just a letter of inquiry. And within an hour of the TRO hearing in Chicago, the committee withdrew its request. And so it's Sheila's courage that I hope starts to be infectious, because, authoritarianism depends on this kind of, ultimate cowardice and complicity and fear when we have so much more power, including legal and constitutional power, to resist.
You obviously are a person with some faith in the courts. And I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit, both the ordinary courts and the immigration courts. Like, what's your experience there? And why do you think this is the right way to go about, resisting at this time?
Yeah, I mean, I think my faith in the courts is muted somewhat. I mean, I think using courts is absolutely essential, and using law is absolutely essential. I'm not so nihilistic to think that law, which is a tool of power, can be ignored in these struggles. So we have to leverage law and the courts. But I worry for all the reasons you all are familiar with, as recognizing the limited power of courts, having not a budget or an army, to manage this onslaught, this just total onslaught on the judicial institutions. And I think it has to be, as it's starting to be braided with direct action, collective action, protest. It would be nice if Congress did anything. I think we think of the courts are limited, but they could, in theory, operate in coordination with another political branch, the Congress, which is at least supposedly designed to constrain the executive. So the courts need, I think, that kind of buffering by the people and by the legislative branch. Otherwise, I think there will be cracks.
And we've been talking about the courts in general. Let's tell us a little bit about the immigration courts. I've never been in one or seen one. Obviously, your client is in one, and that's quite a different system.
Yeah. So the immigration courts are part of the executive branch of government, answerable ultimately to DHS. And their role is incredibly circumscribed. They cannot hear constitutional claims. They have sort of limited review of contrary evidence. And they're largely designed to, in most cases, rubber stamp the rationale for the government's claim for removability. And in this, I've only read about show trials, but witnessing Mahmoud's immigration hearing in front of this hanging Louisiana immigration judge was shocking and chilling. She gave Mahmoud's attorneys 48 hours to respond to the government's evidence against him, denied them a continuance so that they would be able to address that evidence. Was consistently hostile to Mahmoud and counsel, and made very clear that she wanted to get on with it and affirm the Rubio Declaration. So all the government introduced was this 2-page undated declaration from Rubio saying, under this foreign policy bar, I am authorized to find him removable if he's engaged in activities that present a serious adverse risk to the United States foreign policy. And that's it. He so declared, and she so accepted it. She couldn't go behind it, ask for reasons, couldn't test it, would not allow us engage in discovery. This declaration was so Soviet diktat style. There's a part of the statute that actually says that if the determination of adverse policy consequences is based on protected speech activity, the Secretary of State, Rubio, actually has to make a specific certification to that effect. So what Rubio does in the certification, I realize this provision requires me to make a specific certification since it's based on protected speech activity. I hereby certify. That's it. It's like we're in a court in Moscow in 1982 or something. The dear leader has said so, therefore it is. And that's not a real court, which is why, importantly, many of these cases involve independent legal challenges in federal courts pursuant to habeas corpus.
Right. And also, to some degree, that arbitrariness is what led Donald Trump's sister to find the thing void for vagueness, right? Or
That's
unconstitutionally void, because essentially there's no guidance to the administrator. Again, he could come after me because he didn't like bald people or something like that if I was not documented. So,
agreed.
I wonder, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about your earlier work. So I met you actually through my spouse who's working on Guantanamo. And there strikes me as something very similar between the work you were doing there and the work you're doing now, in the sense that both are trying to create a kind of zone of lawlessness or arbitrariness at which the courts cannot reach, or which, administrators and government officials have total discretion. Can you just tell us about your work in Guantanamo and if it's ongoing?
And I think everyone is shocked and terrified, as we should be, But there are a lot of eerie parallels to the post 9/11 period, including, the mass disappearances of Muslims in Brooklyn, Queens, and New Jersey into immigration detention, and the creation of a prison in Guantanamo that the administration intentionally tried to locate outside the jurisdiction of U.S. courts. That was the avowed purpose. The government, when they have custody over someone, can do a lot to manipulate jurisdictional rules and evade the power of the court. And here, too, once they've apprehended all of these students, there are a number of them, the pattern is to shift them around, evade the jurisdiction of, let's call them the home courts in the Northeast, and spirit them away in the middle of the night to Louisiana, which, the detention facility that Mahmoud is in is 5 hours from New Orleans drive. So it's its own little Guantanamo gulag. As outrageous as these actions are, I'm sort of reminded that, and again, this is the courts are critical, but these things take a long time, and I think sometimes the courts are like overly solicitous to these kind of arguments, as if they're, not in bad faith, not sort of transparently wrong. I think we've been frustrated a little bit by our federal judge in New Jersey. He's incredibly smart, but he's really taking a long time to get these jurisdictional questions right, I suppose. But meanwhile, he has the power, and even had the power pursuant to an emergency request we made on Sunday when his wife went into labor, to grant bail. I mean, what is the mystery behind that? Sort of have him check in with ICE, put him on an ankle bracelet. It's such a routine process, but the government wields so much power when they, have the body. And as I tried to tell the judge, the government's claiming that they have the body, but you have the power over the body. You should bring him here now. That's your job. Like, this is habeas of all things. I think, to me, the kind of terrifying part of this is just, it's one thing to revoke someone's student visa and, give them 30 to 60 days to find their way home. It's quite another where that revocation is paired with the very goal of this in terrorum action of putting someone in jail. Mahmoud Khalil is, I'm not trying to be like humble brag. He's a very good legal team, and he's been in jail for 7 weeks. And so, everyone is understandably terrified, not just that they might lose their academic opportunity, but that they could spend 6 months in a detention facility in Louisiana. And that happened with another Columbia student who around the same weekend was visited by ICE in her dorm room, and she made the decision to escape. She was told her visa was revoked. Columbia University sent her an email demanding she evacuate her dorm room by 7 p.m. So she went to her aunt's house in upstate New York, went to Canada, and escaped the United States, home to India, rather than try and fight from inside a Louisiana detention center. That's America these days, yeah.
But Baher, I think just picking up on Tom's question, related to your Guantanamo work before, because I actually think you have like a lot of perspective on where all of these things may be going. Just in the Khalil case, we have, I think, a bunch of different threads that many of us that are working in the human rights space coming together, right? So we have an attack on institutions that can have kind of like a resistant perspective, foundations, civil society organizations, universities, the media. Then we have an attack on a particular group of people, immigrants, which has been another kind of like thread that has been pretty consistent with the current administration. And then we have an attack on certain rights here, like speech, expression. And then, of course, we have the particular focus on political advocacy around Israel and Palestine. So I want to just like set that up as, these different threads that are captured in the Khalil case, but really to ask you a bigger question, which is, and maybe this is a question about priorities that CCR is setting, but I think it's specifically a question about how do you think this is going to play out? So with all of these various kind of things that are a focus for different forms of repression. Can you just like take us through like when you're awake at 3 a.m. at night and you imagine what the next month or 2 or 3 are going to look like? Like, what are the things that you worry about and think are going to become more and more concerning?
Yeah, I mean, I think you ticked off a number of features that are, it's an obviously frequently used word, but are features of an authoritarian regime that wants to govern through some one-party rule and like largely without dissent, and where dissent will become not, normal part of the discourse, but criminalized. One piece that might have been missing from your catalog is the invocation of like wartime narratives and wartime authority. So the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, the soon-to-be invocation of the Insurrection Act, the closing of the southern border by relying on Article 4 of the Constitution that requires the government to repel an invasion. And so one place where I see this, is very similar is that this administration is, projecting a global war on terrorism, but at the southern border, not, externally, and invoking those military powers. I don't mean to be alarmist, but I think the sort of identifying who enemies are of the state, dissidents, immigrants, invoking military authority. I think the goal is not to limit it to the border or to seacoast. I think ultimately the goal is to normalize the possibility of military presence on the interior. And so either in the midterm elections or the next presidential elections, the administration would seek to normalize and legitimize the use of the military domestically to carry out the first 4 authoritarian actions you want: repression of dissent, elimination of attacking immigrants, and ultimately one-party rule. I have to hope we won't get there, but it does really require sort of like an obvious recognition of what's at stake and a will to fight it collectively. Because no one can do this. No one institution can do this on their own. Civil society needs big law, which needs the courts, which needs universities, in order to preserve like just the most basic democratic processes.
Wow, what do you have to say about that amazing interview with Baher? There's a sense that if you follow the rules, the legal immigration rules, then traditionally you are seen as being the beneficiary of all constitutional protections, including those of the First Amendment. And so this seems to be a pretty severe speech-related act of retaliation against someone for their specific speech. Seems to be an obvious violation of the First Amendment. But the immigration statute does have this odd provision, which seems to give total discretion to the Secretary of State to just decide that people are no longer that their presence is a risk to the foreign policy of the United States, and so can deport them. So the statute itself has been brought to light through this, and it's an extremely broad and somewhat scary statute.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, there's a few things that this case has made me think about. One is just what are the rights of citizenship and like what are nationality rights? I was actually a legal permanent resident in the U.S. until I think I was 16 or 17. When my parents moved to the U.S., once we got our LPR status, back then it was sort of considered almost like being a citizen, but allowed you to preserve, your citizenship from the country you came from, and with me it was Peru. And there just wasn't, there wasn't as much of a sense of compulsion to become a citizen, to take that extra step, because the sense was that once you were an LPR, you were a fully You were sort of a full person here, and it was understood that you were making a life in this country. And I think that seeing the distinction between LPR and national, that the Trump administration has made very clear, and obviously this is not the first time that distinction has been drawn, but I think the distinction now seems like pretty urgent. And I'm a citizen now; my entire family are citizens, but it was just a very scary thing to realize that the rights that you have, when you really do affiliate with a country and make your life there, that they can be divided into this fine-grained way. And then I think also the fluidity of it all, right? Because I think one thing that's been scaring people is that maybe this LPR distinction is just a pit stop, that you can actually start making distinctions with citizens. And then if you can't count on, your rights as a national generating from that status, then what are you? Then you start finding yourself into like a stateless world. And it actually makes human rights more urgent, right? Because you and I support a system that recognizes rights above the nation state. Often the response is we don't need it, right? Because nation states are providing all the rights and giving all the services. But now we're seeing just what a weak system that can be under the right administration.
Absolutely. I think you mentioned a couple things there. So I have friends who are naturalized citizens, which I guess you are actually.
I am, yeah.
So there are processes for denaturalization. And so this is to me, the single biggest concern of this whole case. As I'm willing to explain, I don't have much sympathy with the movement of which he was a part. But the fact is that it's had an immediate chilling effect on free speech on campus, and that's absolutely terrible. A chilling effect not just on non-citizens, who certainly now are watching what they say, but even, those who are naturalized citizens, or really any of us, because the way this interacts, of course, with the Kilmer-Abrego-Garcia case, where they can make an administrative error with regard to anyone, even me, and I'm not a naturalized citizen, I'm born here. An administrative error, I'm in the prison in El Salvador, and the administration's claim is there's nothing they can do and they have no obligation to try to get me back. So you add all that up, it's having an enormous chilling effect on free speech in this country on many issues, but including the Palestine issue. And that's unacceptable. That's unacceptable to me.
Yeah. No, and I think the overall idea that you can make claims on your government because of your status in relation to it, that's so important to just the very basic foundations of democracy and the way that we understand it, And here we have a state that is actually playing with those definitions and sending a message that actually you can't make claims, And I think that's I think as scary as it gets, when it comes to the idea of democracy and state accountability and rule of law.
Yeah, I think you said something really interesting before, which is this is why an international system would be really terrific. In other words, if there were genuine limits that were imposed by international law on what states could do, and those things were enforced, that provides a floor so that even if your own state turns against you, which of course it does for hundreds of millions of citizens every day all around the world, still there'd be some minimum floor of protection. And I think this case brings home, or should bring home, to Americans, this and the Kilmer-Abrego-Garcia case, that such a system is in our national interest, such a system is in our individual interest, because, just trust us as a request for, a reassuring request from the government just isn't cutting it right now.
Yeah, it never does. This reminds me actually of our first season when we talked to Ayelet Shachar, who wrote The Birthright Lottery. At the time, we were having this conversation, which I think is a real conversation, which is just, if you really think about, I guess, the unfairness of the fact that the rights that you end up, or the benefits that you can expect from your state, really just have to do with where you happen to be born. And that there's sort of a fundamental unfairness there. But now I think what's happening now in the U.S. also adds this other element of across time, right? Because you can be born in a state where you may actually think you won the lottery, which I think a lot of Americans do think that or have thought that in the past. And then all of a sudden you find yourself on the bad end of the lottery, if you just end up with the right administration in the right moment in history. So this is the human rights system, I think, is intended to provide some stability, because states do ebb and flow in terms of their stability, in terms of their respect for human rights, in terms of of just how they're doing as a cohesive society, and the human rights system is supposed to set some standard that provides at least guidance for what the state citizen relationship is supposed to look like. There's something else I wanted to talk to you about, Tom, that after we stopped recording and you and I just talked to Baher a little bit afterwards, we know him well. There was such a desperation in his voice about, or just a frustration with the way that the judge was kind of, dealing with the case. I think they had hoped for more decisive action on the part of the judge, and instead his client is, still detained, while there have been similar cases where the clients have actually been released. And I think it's worth saying also that his wife just had a baby, which is just so awful. But it just made me think a bit about, especially in our field, there's a lot of hope for the courts and how the courts are actually going to stop and direct state action now, and sort of set limits. But I think that this is really an illustration of what is probably really going to happen, which is just like you have some judges doing one thing on, in some contexts, other judges doing other things in other contexts. And it's just not a great system to actually reflect cohesive government positions, and I'm curious about your thoughts about this, because I don't know that the courts can replace responsible executive action and effective congressional action, and what the limits are actually going to look like. And I don't know, just where we'll actually find ourselves.
Our system is designed for branches that will seek to expand their power, but also a certain degree of what you might call constitutional good faith, that they will, make facially plausible claims as they assert their power. And of course, this administration has been, I don't call it totally lawless, I call it law-ish, because in every case there is some law at the background, which if you followed all these procedures, you could withhold the university money. If you followed all these procedures, you could denaturalize someone, etc. And you go down the list, but they just go straight to the illegal, to the sanction without any of those processes. Then they're doing obviously facially illegal things like the attacks on the law firms. We don't like your law firm, we're not going to let you in the federal courts. That's obviously constitutional bad faith.
Yeah.
And so the system is not designed for that. The courts are slow. There's only 800, 900 federal judges, and you can easily overwhelm them with just the sheer number of cases. And this is a form of abuse, obviously. So I don't know what to do about it or what to say about it, other than ultimately the electoral remedy is all we've got, and mobilization for that, because, even if the administration's really down with all this, it's the marginal House members who are Republicans who will lose their seats if there is, in fact, a landslide election the other way in the midterms, who might provide some outer boundary of restraint. There's a few senators, Republican senators, who have been speaking up, especially people like Lisa Murkowski, who aren't afraid of being primaried and such. And so that's all we got. And of course, that takes a while too. All that said, what's interesting is that sometimes you see them try something that's patently illegal and then backing off completely. And that's what's happened with the student visas in universities, as I understand it. They withdrew many of them. Now they've stopped those withdrawals. I do have a good friend who was overseas who lost his visa on the way returning to this country. And then that was reinstated after a couple of weeks. So it doesn't seem to be like this is a grand plan. It seems more like, let's sow a bunch of chaos and see what sticks. So really, to be honest, I just can't get my head around why anyone would think this is a good idea. But hey, they have a theory.
Yeah. Well, it also depends on what you're trying to accomplish, right? And I think that for my sense is that a lot of these things are to do what you just said, create uncertainty, create chaos so that you can actually engage in the acts you want to engage in because the floor is open. And so if that's your goal, then it is actually pretty effective. If you really are, if the goal really is to minimize the number of foreign students in universities, which may also be a side goal of some kind, this is definitely not the best way to do it. But I think that there's the sort of macro and the smaller goals.
Let me say something about Mahmoud Khalil. I obviously don't know anything about him. I have no reason not to believe Bahar's assertion that he's, a nice guy and, means well for everybody. But the group of which he was part is a very ugly one, I have to say. Columbia University Apartheid Divest. This is the group, one member of whom had, gotten suspended for saying that Zionists didn't deserve to live, which I think could lead, in a campus context to be a genuine threat for, people would be seriously afraid given all the violence of the demonstrations that was going on at Columbia to begin with. And then that group, although they initially apologized, withdrew their apology and endorsed violence as the solution. Now that's First Amendment protected, but to my mind, I have no sympathy with that, and I think that we ought to call that out. It's the same group, by the way, that took over the building. There's a lawsuit by the two janitors who were held hostage for 24 hours and called Jew lovers, and they were injured during the process and traumatized. And I understand haven't been able to return to work, so this isn't a light matter. And I think we human rights people do ourselves a grave disservice by pretending that this is all well and good and this is just a normal part of the struggle.
I mean, I don't disagree with any of that, and I don't know anything about the group. I think a lot about, and I've mentioned this to you before, a conversation that also took place at U Chicago a while ago with Ben Stern and Ira Glasser. Ben Stern being the Holocaust survivor that was involved in the Skokie case that tried to prevent the Nazi march, and Ira Glasser, the former head of the ACLU. They became really good friends, and had a pretty long-term relationship in which they were essentially in an ongoing debate about what I think is really a central question for us now. Ben Stern sort of as a Holocaust survivor understanding the harm of speech. Speech can be really, really harmful. And which I think is part of the point you're making. It's perspectives and speech can be awful and can transform societies in an awful way, And then Ira Glasser, being of the sort of traditional classic ACLU perspective, which is, yes, speech can be awful, but the worst society is where you can't say things that you are thinking and people are restricted because that stuff is still there, but then we can't actually air it in the public space. And I think, I left that conversation watching these two people who had been at such odds and in such a deep way and had tried to understand each other, really not knowing, where I fall, because I see they both want the same society, but just think that there's a different path to getting there. For me, it's not an easy question. I think I definitely fall on the speech side, just because it's the safest. It's not the most comfortable place to be, but I do think it's the safest place to be. So in a way, I don't have to ask myself a lot of those questions, because I do think that, I can vehemently disagree with people, find what they're saying to be completely disgusting, but I'm always going to defend their right to say it. And I think especially in the space you and I exist in, there is no institution without that as a real protection.
Well, I completely agree. As you know, I'm in that classical liberal space, which reflects a deep optimism about society. Ultimately,
it does. And maybe one that's not even warranted. I mean, we don't know.
I still have it. I think in the long run, as society works things out, but who knows, generative AI, there's lots of challenges to that view, but the fundamental principle strikes me as right. All I'm saying is, there's a tendency to say, obviously there's horrors going on in Gaza. Therefore, everything that everyone says or does to oppose those must be okay and must be innocent as the driven snow. I'm sorry. That's wrong. And I am expressing myself on the show.
I was going to say, and I will defend your right to say that.
I'm calling bullshit, and you can use that on calls for violence, because I think that is traditionally the line. And it's we all know that's not a perfect line at all either. By the way, free speech, we're very expansive in this country, and maybe we're too expansive. I don't really take that position that we've got it exactly right by any means. But as between trusting the society to get it wrong in the long run and the state to get it right in the short run in terms of its regulation of who can say what, I choose the society. And that's why I do take the liberal view.
Yeah. No, and I do think that we're in a complicated moment because, if you add misinformation and, the complicated relationship we all have with truth and facts now, and the amount of just voices and spaces, and it's becoming really complicated. I think it's becoming complicated. The old school, like, we'll all just sort of shout at each other and something will emerge, which I think is like very classical. I think that doesn't reflect how I'm experiencing reality. But I also think that there is still an application of speech principles in this reality. We are just figuring out what that looks like, So I think that the principle still holds. It's just that the application itself, because we're in such a moment of change, has gotten a bit more complicated. And it's almost like we need to catch up.
The way to understand what's going on, one angle, which Aziz has written on in The Atlantic, and I was expounding upon, is something called the dual state idea. And the dual state is an idea that was coined by a guy named Ernst Fraenkel, who was a survivor of Nazi Germany. And, there are many refugees from Nazi Germany. What was distinctive about him is that he stayed there till 1938. He was a lawyer, and because he had been a veteran of World War I, he was allowed to stay when many others were kicked out and denied the right to practice law. So he practiced law under Nazism for 5 years. And what was interesting is that he could win cases. Some Jewish clients could win cases. He was able to practice ordinary law in which contracts and property were upheld. But then what he noticed, of course, is that the Nazi state would intervene selectively to define certain things as being beyond the pale. So the dual state is a state which has both a lawful component and then a zone of lawlessness, which it's up to the political powers to define. And I think that's what Trump is trying to set up, or would be happy to have. That's Kilmer Abrigo Garcia. He's not under any protection of any court, and that was because of an administrative error. So there's a kind of temptation to try to set up a system in which the political enemies are outside any protection of law. And I think it's pretty scary. Hopefully our courts will not let that happen. Previous attempts, like at Guantanamo, were limited by cases like, as Claudia Hamdan and Boumediene and such, which said, there isn't a zone free of law. U.S. courts can reach into those cases. We're not going to provide them any remedies, but we at least can reach them. But that thinking that the courts can, in theory, reach everywhere is absolutely the antithesis of the dual state. So we're going to see which holds.
I feel that we would be remiss in not discussing the new nomination of the U.S. ambassador to the UN and how it intersects with all of this. Do you have thoughts about this?
Well, I'm interested in your views. Tell me how you feel about it, given...
Well, it didn't have to be Mike Waltz. I mean, he needed someone new. That's true.
Tell us about Mike Waltz. What do you know about him, and why are you afraid of him?
I mean, I don't know anything about him in relation to the UN. I know that people are really worried because he seems to be like somewhat incompetent. And he's probably not going to come in to like build up the relationship between the US and the UN, but maybe just strategic destruction. But again, I don't know. I mean, the incompetence part is the thing that I'm most worried about. It also seems like, I think it's to me a message of how much Trump doesn't value the United Nations. Not that we needed that kind of message, but this also came on the heels of Mike Waltz, undergoing a lot of criticism in his role. What was it, the National Security Agency? Is that where he was? So I think that to me this is like, what do we call it? Like a consolation prize for Mike Waltz that is not really intended to be a very important role. That is the way that I have interpreted this.
Well, I think you should be quite happy that he's going over there, because even though he's an ideologue, he's obviously a total incompetent. He added, the Atlantic journalist Jeffrey Goldberg to the Signal chat, which then Pete Hegseth, our Fox News Secretary of Defense, proceeded to tell all about the impending strikes on the Houthis. These people are not models of efficiency and talent. Of course, they can do a lot of trouble, but I mean, maybe we should maybe you should spell out why you're worried. What does a UN ambassador do? They go there and they give speeches on the floor of the UN on behalf of the president, and they berate and they criticize and they announce the U.S. policy.
No, they do a lot more than that. I mean, they determine, first of all, how the U.S. is going to interact with the human rights system. The ambassador also decides like where U.S. resources are going to go. They decide how they're going to leverage U.S. power to get other states to do things. I mean, all of this, everything that happens at the UN level is done diplomatically ultimately. So if the U.S. uses its power, for example, to get states to withdraw from the ICCPR, there's a million things that I think the U.S. could actually accomplish if it wants to. It could try to make the Human Rights Council, even though it's not on the Human Rights Council, but it still has a presence in Geneva. It could actually try to influence what's happening in the Human Rights Council. The U.S. has a huge amount of power over many states that, that have particular kinds of interests, right? And it could try to realign those interests as well. I mean, just to give you an example, the special expert on gender identity and sexual orientation, there's a lot of concern that mandate's not going to be renewed. The U.S. could have a huge amount of influence over that. I mean, the U.S. also already basically was the catalyst to the special expert losing most of his funding, but it could do way worse things than that. The treaty system right now, in my mind, is kind of hanging on in a very, very delicate context. And the U.S. could really tip things over in a way that's harmful, especially if other states don't step up. And honestly, Tom, one other thing, this whole competence incompetence thing is no longer a comfort for me. I think that we often think you put incompetent people in positions of power and so they won't be able to achieve what they want, but that's not what ends up happening. There's a lot of ways to destroy a system, and some of it can be done in a way that's kind of chaotic and appears incompetent, but still gets done.
Yeah, well, that's very helpful. I do understand now your concern. I mean, traditionally, you might have a UN ambassador from the United States playing a kind of a dual role, which is not just to reflect administration policy in the UN, but to advocate for the UN within the administration. And I don't imagine that there's going to be much of that with any Trump appointee, frankly. The person is there to sow chaos and such. And so I do, but I was reading something the other day that there is the funding is slipping away. So do you have any sense of how long UN funding will last, especially if the United States pulls its contributions? And what would the UN look like without the United States? We talked about this a little when we talked about the ambassador.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. is a huge funder to the UN, but it's not, I think the UN would constrict, that's if the U.S. actually stopped funding the UN or started funding in a very specific way. I mean, it won't disappear, and there are certain things that it won't be able to do. I know within the special expert system, there's already conversations about, special experts only being able to do one country visit a year instead of two. There are these things that end up costing money, but it's part of the monitoring system for human rights, and so the less of that there is, the less states are going to be compelled to actually abide by their obligations. It's bad, it's all really bad, and it will depend on other states kind of stepping in and maybe trying to make up in part for the U.S. shortfall. I don't know if you remember, this was years ago that the head of the Inter-American Commission came to the University of Chicago and gave a speech. And at the time, there was a crisis in the regional human rights system in the Americas because the U.S. was not paying its contribution. And I don't know if you remember, but I think it was either the Netherlands or Norway that basically stepped in and made up for the shortfall so that the Inter-American system could continue going forward. So yeah, we might find ourselves in those kinds of situations.
Well, look, this is the problem. The UN has got a structural problem because of the countries which could do that. Many are located in Europe. Many European governments are turning rightward. Many mini Trumps are rising in Europe. So, how is that funding going to come when they're adopting Trump-like strategies? On the other hand, you have a lot of funding coming from China, the second biggest support. And, I'm sure people in the UN are like, oh, thank goodness someone's paying our salaries. Color me skeptical. that that's going to do anything to advance any kind of genuine human rights interest in the United Nations. As you know, I've written about this. Human rights with Chinese characteristics are, not actually human rights at all. And so I don't think that there's going to be I think the situation for your part of the UN might be genuinely difficult no matter who steps in to provide the funding.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think that is undoubtedly true. And there are just various versions of this that are worse and better. So I don't know. I mean, I honestly don't know what will happen.